Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something we all do every single night, but in a way that would feel completely alien to us now. We're talking about sleep in the Middle Ages. Not the romantic, candlelit version you see in films, but the actual, lived experience of closing your eyes in a world without electric lights, without thermostats, without the concept of a bedroom as we know it. Before we get started, if you enjoy these deep dives into the stranger corners of history, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious who's joining me on these nighttime journeys into the past. Now, let's ease into this together. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Because tonight, we're going to bed the medieval way, and I promise you, nothing about it will feel familiar. Picture this for a moment. You're exhausted. The sun has just disappeared below the horizon, and with it, the world has transformed. There's no switch to flip. No lamp to turn on. The darkness that descends isn't the manageable, controllable darkness of modern life. It's thick, complete, and oddly alive with sounds you can't quite identify. You're not heading to your private bedroom with its memory foam mattress and climate control. You're heading to whatever sleeping space your station in life has afforded you, and chances are, you won't be alone when you get there. Let's start with what you're sleeping on, because this might be the most shocking adjustment of all. If you're a peasant, which statistically you almost certainly would be, your bed is not a bed in any sense we'd recognize. It's a thin mat, maybe stuffed with straw if you're fortunate, maybe just woven rushes if you're not, laid directly on the packed earth floor of your one-room cottage. That's it. No box spring. No frame. No foundation. Just you, a scratchy barrier between your body and the cold ground, and whatever threadbare blanket you've managed to keep from falling apart completely. The straw inside your mattress, if you can call it that, isn't fresh. You changed it maybe once this year, possibly twice if you were feeling ambitious. It's compressed from months of bodies pressing down on it, and it's become a thriving ecosystem of its own. Fleas live in there. Lice. Bed bugs that emerge at night to feast on you while you sleep. You've stopped noticing the bites most of the time. They're just part of existence, like hunger or cold or the ache in your back from working the fields all day. Everyone has them. Even the king has them, though his bed is considerably more elaborate than yours. Your mattress, such as it is, gets thinner with every passing night. The straw breaks down, compresses, works its way through the rough fabric meant to contain it and pokes you at odd angles. Sometimes you wake with strange scratches you don't remember getting. Sometimes you wake to find small dark spots on your blanket, little specks that you've learned not to investigate too closely. In the morning, you roll up this mattress and push it against the wall or stuff it in a corner, because the same space where you sleep at night becomes your living space during the day. There's no such thing as a bedroom. There's just the one room, and it serves every purpose. But let's say you're not a peasant. Let's say you're moderately prosperous, maybe a merchant or a craftsman who's done well for himself. Your sleeping arrangements improve, but perhaps not in the ways you'd expect. you have an actual bed frame, elevated off the floor, which is already a luxury. This frame is made of wood, and stretched across it are ropes, thick hemp ropes woven in a crisscross pattern to support what passes for a mattress. These ropes have to be tightened regularly. Every night, in fact, or they sag under your weight and you find yourself rolling toward the middle of the bed by morning. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" actually comes from. It's not a pleasant wish. It's a literal instruction. Tighten those ropes, or you'll have a miserable night. On top of these ropes sits your mattress, but it's not one mattress. It's layers. First, a canvas sack stuffed with more straw, then if you're doing well, another sack filled with wool. And if you're truly prosperous, on top of all that goes a featherbed, a thick fabric envelope filled with actual feathers that create something approaching softness. These featherbeds are precious. They're mentioned in wills. They're passed down through families. They represent wealth and comfort in a way that's hard to overstate. But even with all these layers, even with the featherbed that would seem luxurious to anyone sleeping on straw, your bed is still crawling with life. The feathers attract mites. The wool harbors moths. The straw, always the straw, continues to host its population of fleas and bed bugs. Medieval people tried everything to combat these pests. They scattered herbs between the layers, lavender and mint and chamomile, hoping the scents would repel the insects. They hung bunches of these same herbs around the sleeping area. They made their sheets from tightly woven linen, creating what they called ticking, meant to prevent the bugs from easily moving between layers. They stored their bedding in cedar chests when not in use, because cedar was known to discourage moths and other pests. None of it really worked. The pests remained a constant, accepted part of life. Delousing was a regular activity, almost a social one. Women would sit together in doorways or courtyards when weather permitted, picking through each other's hair, removing lice and their eggs with fine-toothed combs. It wasn't considered disgusting or shameful. It was just something that needed doing, like mending clothes or grinding grain. Even illustrations in medieval manuscripts show this casual intimacy, people helping each other manage the infestation that everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, endured. The bedding itself tells its own story about medieval life. If you had sheets, and not everyone did, they were made of linen or hemp, coarse and rough against the skin. Linen was precious. Good linen, fine linen, was something only the wealthy could afford. Most people made do with whatever fabric they could weave or trade for, and these sheets were used until they literally fell apart, then patched and mended and used some more. Over time, they softened with repeated washing and wear, but they never achieved the smooth comfort we associate with bedding today. Blankets were wool, thick and scratchy and heavy. In winter, this weight was welcome, necessary even. But they also held moisture, and on damp nights, which were most nights in Northern Europe, they'd gradually absorb humidity from the air until they felt almost wet against your skin. This was particularly true in peasant cottages, where the thatched roof above you would collect moisture and actually drip, condensation down onto whoever was sleeping below. Small birds and mice lived in that thatch too, and their droppings and debris would filter down through the straw onto the people trying to sleep beneath. Now let's talk about what you're wearing to bed, because this is where things get interesting. For most of the medieval period, the answer is likely nothing. Medieval people, across all classes, often slept naked. We know this from illustrations, from references in literature, from court documents that describe nighttime events. There was no concept of sleepwear as a separate category of clothing. Clothes were expensive. Fabric was expensive. Why would you waste it on something you only wore while unconscious? But there were exceptions and variations. Some people slept in their undergarments, the long linen shirts called shifts or chemises that served as the first layer under their daytime clothes. This had practical advantages. Bed linens were even more precious than regular clothes, harder to wash, more time-consuming to maintain. Sleeping in a shift meant your body oils and sweat were absorbed by something that could be more easily laundered than the bedding itself. It was a layer of protection for your sheets and mattress, a barrier between your flesh and the expensive fabrics of your bed. Monks had different rules, prescribed by their religious orders. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, explicitly required monks to sleep fully clothed in their habits. The reasoning was partly practical. Monks had to rise multiple times during the night for prayers, for the services called matins and lauds that punctuated the darkness. Being already dressed meant they could move quickly from sleep to prayer without the delay of getting dressed. But it was also about modesty and discipline, about maintaining certain standards even in the vulnerability of sleep. Now let's talk about what you're wearing to bed, because this is where things get interesting. For most of the medieval period, the answer is likely nothing. Medieval people, across all classes, often slept naked. We know this from illustrations, from references in literature, from court documents that describe nighttime events. There was no concept of sleepwear as a separate category of clothing. Clothes were expensive. Fabric was expensive. Why would you waste it on something you only wore while unconscious? But there were exceptions and variations. Some people slept in their undergarments, the long linen shirts called shifts or chemises that served as the first layer under their daytime clothes. This had practical advantages. Bed linens were even more precious than regular clothes, harder to wash, more time-consuming to maintain. Sleeping in a shift meant your body oils and sweat were absorbed by something that could be more easily laundered than the bedding itself. It was a layer of protection for your sheets and mattress, a barrier between your flesh and the expensive fabrics of your bed. Monks had different rules, prescribed by their religious orders. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, explicitly required monks to sleep fully clothed in their habits. The reasoning was partly practical. Monks had to rise multiple times during the night for prayers, for the services called matins and lauds that punctuated the darkness. Being already dressed meant they could move quickly from sleep to prayer without the delay of getting dressed. But it was also about modesty and discipline, about maintaining certain standards even in the vulnerability of sleep. But here's where medieval sleep diverges most dramatically from our modern experience. You are not sleeping alone. Let me emphasize this because it cannot be overstated. Privacy, as we understand it, does not exist. The idea that sleep is a private, Individual activity that happens in isolated rooms would have seemed bizarre, even wasteful, to medieval people. Sleep was communal. Sleep was shared. Sleep happened with other people, sometimes many other people, in the same space and often in the same bed. If you're a peasant family, everyone sleeps together. Mother, father, children, all in the same area, possibly all on the same mattress if you only have one. There was often an accepted arrangement for how bodies were positioned. In some regions, parents would sleep in the middle, daughters along the wall side for protection, sons on the outer edge. The youngest children would be closest to their respective parents. But this wasn't a strict rule, just a common pattern that emerged from practical considerations of warmth, safety, and space management. And it wasn't just family. If you had a guest, a traveler passing through, a relative visiting from another village, they'd be invited to squeeze into the sleeping area too. Refusing this would have been incredibly rude, a violation of hospitality customs that governed medieval life. So you'd rearrange, make room somehow, and accept that your bed, already crowded, was about to become more so. The same went for servants who worked in your household. They might have their own pallets on the floor, but they'd be sleeping in the same room, breathing the same air, hearing every sound you made and you hearing every sound they made. If you were wealthy enough to have separate sleeping chambers, and very few people were, you still weren't alone. Your servants slept in your room. Ladies in waiting slept on trundle beds or pallets at the foot of their mistress's bed. Personal servants might sleep actually in your bed, especially if you were a woman, as a form of protection and companionship. This wasn't considered strange. It was normal, expected. The idea of sleeping totally alone was associated with poverty or punishment, not preference. When you traveled and stayed at an inn, you'd be shown to a room with multiple beds, each bed intended to hold 3 or 4 people. You'd climb in next to complete strangers, travelers you'd never met and would likely never see again. There were social conventions around this. You were expected to lie still, not fidget too much, not hog the blankets, generally keep to yourself despite being pressed against someone else's body for the entire night. But awkwardness was better than cold, and body heat was a valuable resource not to be wasted. Even the wealthy, sleeping in their grand beds with their elaborate curtains and expensive linens, might share that bed with multiple people. A nobleman and his wife might have their children in the bed with them, plus a servant or 2 within arm's reach. These beds were enormous, 8 or 9 feet across, because they needed to be. They were pieces of furniture designed for multiple occupants, and in an era when beds were the single most expensive item in most households, it made sense to maximize their use. These grand beds deserved their own discussion because they were extraordinary objects. The bed of a wealthy person was a showpiece, a statement of status more overt than any other furniture they owned. It would be elevated on a platform to keep it away from the cold floor and any drafts. It had 4 posts rising up, supporting a canopy, a fabric ceiling that helped trap warmth. Heavy curtains hung from this canopy on all sides, curtains that could be pulled closed to create a small, warmer space within the larger cold room, a fabric room within a room. These curtains were often the most expensive part. They might be embroidered with the family's coat of arms, their initials, their motto. They might be made of wool or heavy linen, sometimes lined with fur for extra insulation. When guests visited, they'd be received in the bedroom, would sit on the bed itself as a mark of honor, would admire the curtains and the coverlets, would understand immediately from the quality and richness of these textiles exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy. The bed was so precious that when wealthy people traveled, they sometimes brought it with them. Not a portable sleeping mat. The actual bed. The whole structure. Servants would disassemble it, transport it to the next location, and reassemble it wherever their lord or lady was staying. This wasn't paranoia. It was practical. Inns and guest houses couldn't be trusted to provide bedding of appropriate quality, and a person of status couldn't be seen sleeping on inferior furniture. The bed traveled with them, along with all its curtains and blankets and sheets, a mobile display of wealth and rank. But let's return to the more common experience, because most medieval people weren't carting elaborate four-poster beds across the countryside. Most medieval people were trying to get through the night on inadequate padding, in crowded conditions, with the constant awareness that darkness brought danger. Real danger and imagined danger, and the line between the two was not always clear. Night in the Middle Ages was frightening in ways modern people struggle to comprehend. When the sun set, when the fire burned low, when the last candle guttered out, you were plunged into darkness so complete that you literally could not see your hand in front of your face. There were no street lights. No neighbors' windows glowing. No ambient light from anywhere. Just blackness, and within that blackness, sounds that your imagination could transform into anything. Medieval people believed, genuinely believed, that night was when demons walked. When spirits of the dead might appear. When witches performed their rituals and curses took effect. These weren't quaint superstitions. These were real fears that shaped behavior and disturbed sleep. Every creak of wood settling, every rustle in the thatch overhead, every distant sound from the village could be interpreted as something supernatural, something threatening, something coming for you. Prayer was the main defense. People prayed before sleep with an urgency we can barely imagine, because they genuinely worried they might not wake up. The prayer that children still say today, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," that wasn't cute or sentimental when it was first spoken. It was a real acknowledgement of mortality, a recognition that sleep made you vulnerable and death might come during the night. But supernatural fears weren't the only concerns. Fire was a constant danger. Most homes had open flames burning for heat and light, and those flames existed in buildings made largely of wood and thatch. People slept near these fires because they had to, because the cold was unbearable otherwise, but they also knew that falling asleep too close, or having a spark land on dry straw, could turn their home into a death trap within minutes. Villages burned. Entire villages, completely destroyed, because one fire in one house spread to the next and the next until nothing remained. Thieves were another concern, especially if you had anything worth stealing. Doors could be barred but not truly locked. Windows were usually just openings in walls, maybe covered with shutters but easy enough to force. If someone wanted to get in, they probably could. So you slept lightly, always partly alert, ready to wake at unusual sounds. And then there were animal sounds, which in the countryside meant you often had livestock sharing your living space. Cows, pigs, chickens might be penned in one end of your one-room cottage, separated from your sleeping area by nothing more than a low partition. Their noises, their smells, their restlessness became part of your night. You learned to distinguish normal animal sounds from distress, learned to wake if something seemed wrong, but you never achieved the deep, uninterrupted sleep that silence would have provided. In towns and cities, human noise replaced animal noise. Medieval streets were narrow, and sound carried. You'd hear arguments, singing, people stumbling home from taverns, night watch calling out the hours. You'd hear chamber pots being emptied from upper windows into the streets below. You'd hear dogs barking, cats fighting, the screech of rats in the walls. Cities were never truly quiet, and neither was your sleep. But here's the truly remarkable thing about medieval sleep. It didn't happen all at once. This is the part that feels most alien to us. Medieval people didn't sleep for 7 or 8 continuous hours. They slept in 2 distinct segments, what historians now call biphasic or segmented sleep. And this wasn't unusual or disordered sleep. This was normal. This was how everyone did it. You would go to bed shortly after dark, because there was nothing else to do and candles were expensive. This would put you in bed around 8 or 9 in the evening, maybe earlier in winter when darkness fell sooner. You'd sleep for 3 or 4 hours, what was called the first sleep. Then, sometime around midnight or a bit after, you'd wake up. Not jolt awake from a nightmare. Not wake because something was wrong. You'd simply wake, naturally, gently, and you'd be awake for the next hour or 2. This period of wakefulness even had a name. It was called the watch. And during the watch, life continued in a quieter, more reflective way. People didn't see this as insomnia. They didn't lie there frustrated, trying to fall back asleep. They accepted wakefulness as part of the rhythm of the night. And they used this time. Some people prayed. The watch was considered a spiritually potent time, when the barrier between the earthly and divine was thought to be thinner. Prayers spoken during the watch were believed to have special power. Monks were required to rise for midnight prayers, but many laypeople adopted this practice too, finding something meaningful in addressing God in the quiet heart of the night. Others worked. Not heavy physical labor, but tasks that could be done in dim light or by touch. Women might peel rushes for making candles later. They might card wool or spin thread. Men might sharpen tools, repair equipment, prepare materials for the next day's work. Farmers sometimes checked on their animals during the watch, making sure everything was secure before returning to bed for their second sleep. Couples talked. The watch was one of the few times when spouses might have genuine privacy, or at least semi-privacy, to speak with each other away from the demands of children and work and community. Conversations during the watch were often intimate, reflective. This was when plans were made, worries were shared, arguments were sometimes resolved. The darkness and quiet created a space for a different kind of communication than was possible during the busy day. And yes, couples had sex. This was actually a common enough practice during the watch that medical texts specifically mentioned it. Some physicians even recommended it, suggesting that intercourse after the first sleep, when the body was rested but not yet deeply asleep again, was healthiest for conception. The watch offered a time when children were more likely to be fully asleep, when the household was quieter, when the couple could connect with somewhat more privacy than other times allowed. Some people simply lay there, thinking. Not worrying, necessarily, though surely some did. But also just letting their minds wander in a way that daytime busyness rarely permitted. Modern sleep scientists who've studied this biphasic pattern found that people who experience it naturally often report a kind of peaceful contemplation during their wake period, a meditative state that feels neither fully asleep nor fully awake, characterized by unusual mental clarity and calmness. References to first sleep and second sleep appear throughout medieval literature, in court documents, in private letters, in medical texts. Chaucer mentions it. French texts refer to the premier soma. Italian texts discuss primo sonno. These weren't poetic flourishes. They were casual references to a pattern of sleep so universal that authors didn't bother explaining it. Everyone knew what they meant. Then, after this period of wakefulness, you'd return to sleep for your second sleep, which would last until dawn or shortly after. This second sleep was sometimes described as deeper, more restful than the first. You'd wake in the morning feeling, if not refreshed exactly, at least as rested as medieval life permitted. This pattern persisted for centuries, possibly for millennia. It appears to be how humans naturally sleep when they are not constrained by artificial lighting or industrial work schedules. But it's completely disappeared from modern life, so thoroughly that most people today have never heard of it. And when people do wake in the middle of the night now, they're told they have insomnia, they're given sleeping pills, they're encouraged to see it as a disorder that needs correcting rather than a natural rhythm their body might be trying to follow. The disappearance of biphasic sleep happened gradually, beginning in the 17th century and accelerating through the Industrial Revolution. As artificial lighting became more common and more affordable, people stayed up later. Street lamps meant cities were no longer pitch black after dark. Candles and oil lamps became cheap enough that even ordinary households could light their homes into the evening. As bedtimes got later, the first sleep ended later, and gradually the wake period got squeezed out until it vanished entirely, leaving us with the single consolidated sleep block we now consider normal. But in medieval times, this was still far in the future. Medieval people lived and slept according to older rhythms, their bodies responding to light and dark in ways that felt natural because they'd never known anything else. And while their sleep was interrupted by wakefulness, it was also interrupted by cold, by pests, by discomfort, by fear, by crowding, by noise. Sleep was not the peaceful escape it can be for us. It was an endurance test, something to be gotten through until morning brought light and relative safety again. Let's talk about the cold, because this might have been the single most challenging aspect of medieval sleep. We can barely imagine how cold homes were before central heating, before insulation, before double-paned windows. In winter, the temperature inside most homes was barely different from the temperature outside. Your breath would create visible clouds in the air. Water left in containers would freeze solid. and you were expected to sleep in these conditions. Fire helped, but only so much. Peasant cottages might have a simple open hearth in the center of the room, with a hole in the roof above it for smoke to escape, theoretically. In practice, much of the smoke stayed inside, creating a thick haze that made breathing difficult and left everything covered in a layer of soot. But the warmth was necessary, so you tolerated the smoke. You arranged your sleeping area as close to the fire as you dared, close enough to benefit from the heat but not so close that sparks could reach you. Wealthier homes had fireplaces built into walls, with proper chimneys to vent the smoke outside. These were more efficient, less suffocating, but they still didn't heat the entire space. A large medieval chamber might have one fireplace, and only the area immediately around it would be warm. The rest of the room remained frigid. You could be roasting on one side and freezing on the other, turning like meat on a spit to try to warm yourself evenly. Keeping the fire going all night required effort. Someone had to wake periodically to add wood. If the fire went out, getting it started again in the morning was no simple matter. You didn't just strike a match. You had to use flint and steel to create sparks, catch those sparks on tinder, blow gently to encourage flame, carefully add small kindling before graduating to larger pieces. It could take a long time, and during that time, you were miserably cold. So people tried hard to keep fires burning through the night, which meant interrupted sleep for whoever had that responsibility. Bed warmers helped a bit for those who could afford them. These were metal pans, usually brass, with hinged lids and long wooden handles. You'd fill them with hot coals from the fire, close the lid, and slide the warmer between your sheets, moving it around to heat the fabric before climbing in. For a brief, glorious moment, your bed would be almost warm. But coals cooled quickly, and medieval beds were large and drafty. Within an hour, any warmth the bed warmer had provided would dissipate, and you'd be back to relying on body heat and blankets. Heated stones were a cheaper alternative. You'd take a large flat stone, heat it by the fire until it was almost too hot to handle, wrap it in cloth to prevent burns, and place it in the bed near your feet. Again, it provided temporary relief but not lasting warmth. Some people tried to position these stones strategically throughout the bed, creating little islands of warmth, but it was never enough to truly defeat the cold. The curtains around wealthy beds helped more than you might think. By creating a smaller space within the larger cold room, they allowed body heat to accumulate and be retained. With the curtains closed, you were essentially sleeping in a fabric tent, and the warmth from your breathing and body heat would gradually raise the temperature inside this enclosed space to something approaching tolerable. It was still cold, but it was less cold than the room outside. For everyone else, warmth came from piling on blankets and sharing body heat. This is another reason communal sleeping made sense. 3 or 4 bodies in one bed generated significantly more warmth than one body alone. You'd press together, not for affection particularly, but for survival. Children would nestle between adults. Everyone would curl up to minimize exposed surface area. You'd sleep in a tight cluster, like animals in a den, because spreading out meant being cold. Morning brought its own challenges. Waking up meant leaving the relatively warm cocoon of your bed and stepping into a room where frost might coat the walls. If you were lucky enough to have water for washing, it would be ice cold unless you waited for someone to heat it over the fire. More likely, you'd just splash your face with freezing water, or skip washing entirely, and get dressed as quickly as possible in layers of wool that would eventually trap some body heat and make the day more bearable. Summer brought different challenges. The heavy curtains that were essential in winter became suffocating in heat. But opening windows meant letting in not just cooler air but also mosquitoes and other insects. It meant losing what little security the closed house provided. Many people chose to swelter rather than leave themselves exposed to whatever might fly or crawl in during the night. The blankets that barely kept you warm in winter became unbearable in summer, but sleeping without covering meant waking covered in insect bites. There was no good solution, only trade-offs between different kinds of discomfort. Let's talk for a moment about dreams and sleep disturbances, because medieval people experienced these very differently than we do. Dreams were not seen as mere brain activity, random neural firing that meant nothing. Dreams were messages. They were prophetic. They were divine or demonic communications that required interpretation and response. If you had a vivid dream, you'd likely tell others about it during the watch or the next morning, and those others would help you analyze what it meant. Dream dictionaries circulated among the educated, providing standardized interpretations. Certain images in dreams were thought to predict specific future events. A dream about teeth falling out meant death in the family. Dreams about water indicated upcoming sorrow. Flying meant spiritual elevation or possibly demonic temptation, depending on other details. Nightmares were worse. These weren't just scary dreams. They were actual visitations from evil entities called incubi or succubi, demons who sat on your chest and caused breathing difficulties, paralysis, and terror. What we'd now recognize as sleep paralysis was interpreted as demonic attack. People who experienced this frequently might seek religious help, prayers, blessings, sometimes even exorcism. Some wore protective amulets to bed. Others slept with religious items nearby, crosses or relics that were supposed to ward off evil. Night terrors, especially in children, were also understood through a supernatural lens. A child who woke screaming, inconsolable, was thought to have been touched by something evil. Parents would comfort the child, yes, but they'd also say prayers over them, might sprinkle holy water, might consult the local priest about whether additional spiritual protection was needed. These weren't signs of mental disturbance. They were understood as real encounters with the forces of darkness that prowled during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Sleepwalking was particularly alarming. A person who walked while asleep, who performed actions with no memory of them afterward, had clearly lost control of their body to something else. Demonic possession was one explanation. Divine ecstasy was another, if the person sleepwalking seemed to have religious purpose. But either way, sleepwalking marked someone as unusual, possibly dangerous, certainly worth watching. There are documented cases of medieval sleepwalkers who caused injury or even death while in their sleep state, and the legal system struggled with how to assign responsibility for actions performed while unconscious. Medical explanations for sleep problems existed alongside supernatural ones. Physicians understood that worry and anxiety interfered with sleep. They recognized that physical pain, illness, indigestion, all could prevent rest. They prescribed remedies, herbal concoctions meant to promote sleep or calm an anxious mind. Valerian root was popular. Chamomile. Various combinations of herbs drunk as teas or applied as poultices. These remedies had varying levels of effectiveness, but the fact that they were prescribed shows that medieval people understood sleep as something that could be influenced by both natural and supernatural means. When we think about medieval sleep now, from our perspective of climate-controlled bedrooms and personal space and memory foam and blackout curtains, it's almost impossible to comprehend how fundamentally different the experience was. Not just uncomfortable. Not just inconvenient. Different in ways that shaped consciousness, that influenced how people thought about privacy, about the body, about the boundary between waking and sleeping, living and dying, natural and supernatural. Medieval people were not getting good sleep by any modern measure. They were cold. They were uncomfortable. They were bitten by insects throughout the night. They were crowded together with other humans and sometimes animals, breathing air thick with smoke, listening to sounds that frightened them, waking multiple times and accepting this as normal. And yet they functioned. They worked brutal hours at physical labor. They raised children. They built cathedrals and wrote poetry and waged wars and fell in love. They did all of this despite sleeping in conditions we would consider barely tolerable for a single night, let alone an entire lifetime. Perhaps the most profound difference is that medieval people never expected sleep to be comfortable. They had no baseline of a good night's sleep to compare against. This was simply how sleep was. You endured it. You got through it. And when morning came, you got up and faced another day, knowing that night would come again with all its challenges, but knowing too that everyone else was experiencing the same thing. There was no sense of being uniquely deprived or suffering unfairly. This was the human condition. This was life. So tonight, when you climb into your bed with its supportive mattress and clean sheets, when you adjust your thermostat to exactly the temperature you prefer, when you close your door to create private sleeping space for yourself alone, when you expect to sleep through the night undisturbed for 7 or 8 continuous hours, take a moment to recognize how extraordinary these circumstances are. Take a moment to recognize that this comfort, this privacy, this uninterrupted rest, is a gift that our ancestors could barely have imagined. We've traveled back to their world tonight, experienced their sleep through the lens of history. But we get to wake up in ours. And that's worth being grateful for as you drift off in comfort they never knew, but which they made possible through their endurance, their resilience, their stubborn survival through nights that were so much harder than any we'll ever face. If you enjoyed this journey into the surprisingly alien world of medieval sleep, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Let me know in the comments what aspect of medieval life you'd like us to explore next. Until then, sleep well. You've certainly earned it. Good night.